The sun was a merciless hammer in the cloudless sky, beating down upon the parched, cracked earth of the Valley of Elah. It was a hostile, shimmering heat that reflected with a brazen glare off the thousands of bronze helmets and iron spear points of two great armies poised like predators on opposing hills. On one slope, arrayed in a semblance of order that could not mask their deep-seated dread, stood the ranks of Israel, the chosen people of the living God, now utterly paralyzed by a terror that had taken root in their souls. On the other, confident and contemptuous, stood the Philistines, a warrior nation hardened by conquest, their formidable army a bristling forest of iron and bronze, their spear tips glinting like 1,000 predatory eyes. For 40 long days this suffocating stalemate had held, a torturous pause in the brutal, bloody rhythm of ancient warfare. But this was no stalemate of equals. This was a siege of the spirit, a psychological war being masterfully waged by a single, monstrous man, a man who was less a soldier and more a walking, breathing embodiment of war itself. His name was Goliath. He was a name spoken in hushed, fearful whispers in the Israelite tents, a name that had become synonymous with despair. He hailed from the Philistine city of Gath, a place notorious for breeding giants, and he was their undisputed masterpiece, their ultimate weapon. He stood over 9 feet tall, a mountain of sinew and malice, his colossal frame encased in a gleaming coat of scale mail that weighed more than an average man. A heavy bronze helmet, crested and formidable, protected his massive head, and bronze greaves, thick as stovepipes, guarded his tree-trunk legs. The spear he carried was a legend in itself, its shaft like a weaver's beam, its iron point alone weighing as much as a small boulder. His shield-bearer, a man of no small stature himself, walked before him, looking like a child in his shadow. Every morning, as the sun began its relentless assault, and every evening, as the shadows grew long and menacing in the valley, Goliath would stride out from the Philistine lines. He would plant his feet in the dusty expanse between the two armies, his voice a booming, earth-shaking thunder that rolled up the hillsides and crashed like a physical blow against the hearts of the Israelites. "Why do you come out and line up for battle?" he would roar, his words a corrosive acid of contempt. "Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul, your king? Choose a man for yourselves and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, then we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, then you will become our subjects and serve us." Then came the true poison, the words that were not just a challenge to men, but a direct, blasphemous insult to their God. "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." And every time he spoke, a palpable wave of fear, cold and sickening, would wash over the Israelite camp. King Saul, their tall, handsome leader, a man once chosen for his impressive stature, would tremble along with the rawest recruit. They were a nation held hostage, cowering in the shadow of one man, their collective faith as brittle and cracked as the dry valley floor beneath them. The mighty God who had parted the Red Sea, who had toppled the impregnable walls of Jericho with a shout, seemed a distant, forgotten legend, a character from a story told to children, powerless in the face of this 9-foot reality of bronze and iron. Into this theater of profound fear and spiritual paralysis walked a boy. His name was David. He was the youngest of 8 sons, a shepherd from the small, unassuming town of Bethlehem. He was not a soldier. His world was not the clang of sword on shield, but the bleating of sheep, the whisper of the wind through the tall grass, and the gentle melody of his harp. His hands were accustomed to the smooth, worn wood of a shepherd's staff and the taut, responsive strings of his instrument, not the cold, unforgiving grip of a sword hilt. He was handsome, the scriptures said, with a ruddy complexion and eyes that held the clear, untroubled light of one who spends his days under the vast open sky, his heart in communion with his flock and his God. He had not come for war. He had been dispatched by his elderly father, Jesse, on a simple domestic errand, to bring roasted grain and fresh loaves of bread to his 3 eldest brothers, who served in Saul's beleaguered army, and to bring back a token from them, a sign of their welfare. He arrived at the edge of the sprawling camp just as the armies were drawing up their lines for the morning's ritual of terror. The air thick with the nervous shouts of men preparing for a battle they prayed would never come. As he was speaking with his brothers, catching up on news from home, the champion emerged, Goliath. David watched, his shepherd's eyes trained to spot any threat to his flock, taking in the scene with a perspective entirely different from that of the soldiers around him. He saw the giant, a grotesque parody of strength. He heard his blasphemous taunts, a venomous assault on everything he held sacred. And then he saw the reaction. He saw the hardened soldiers of Israel, his own brothers among them, physically recoil, their faces pale with a familiar 40-day-old terror. But in David's heart something different stirred, something pure and powerful. It was not fear. It was a holy, righteous indignation. A fire was kindled in his soul, a protective, zealous love for the honor of his God. This was not merely an insult to the army of Israel. It was a defiant fist shaken in the face of the living God. He turned to the men standing near him, his voice clear and sharp with a disbelief that bordered on outrage. "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel?" he asked. And then, the heart of the matter. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? His eldest brother, Eliab, a man of impressive height like Saul, overheard him. He burned with a hot familial anger, misinterpreting David's righteous zeal as the naive arrogance of a youth out of his depth. "Why have you come down here?" he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." But David was not to be silenced. The giant's words had struck a chord deep within him, a chord of unwavering faith that had been tuned and strengthened by long, solitary hours in the Judean wilderness. There, under the vast silent canopy of the stars, he had learned of a power far greater than any giant of flesh and blood. He had faced down a lion that had snatched a lamb from his flock. He had wrestled with a bear that had threatened his father's livelihood, and in both instances he had not trusted in his own youthful strength, but had called upon and been filled with the supernatural strength of the Lord, the true shepherd of Israel. "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear," he thought with a certainty that was absolute, "will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." His words, so full of a strange, almost reckless confidence, were overheard and eventually reported up the chain of command, all the way to King Saul. The king, desperate for any glimmer of hope, for any crack in the monolith of fear that held his army captive, sent for the boy. David was brought before Saul, and the contrast between them was stark and poignant. The king, tall and regal, but his shoulders slumped with the weight of despair, his eyes haunted. The boy, a shepherd, his face still holding the softness of youth, but his eyes burning with a fire that the king had long since lost. "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine," David said, his voice astonishingly steady and clear in the king's tent. "Your servant will go and fight him." Saul looked at the boy, and a wave of fatherly pity mixed with weary disbelief washed over him. "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him," the king said, his voice heavy with resignation. "You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." It was then that David, with a supple, compelling eloquence, shared his shepherd's testimony. He spoke of the lion, of the bear, of how he had caught them by the jaw and struck them down to save his sheep. He spoke not with bravado, not with the boastful swagger of a warrior recounting his deeds, but with a simple, unshakable faith in his protector. He concluded his story by drawing a direct, spiritual line from the wilderness to the valley. "This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them," he declared, "because he has defied the armies of the living God." A flicker of something, perhaps a long-forgotten memory of his own youthful faith before the burdens of kingship had crushed it, stirred in Saul's heart. He looked at David, at the unwavering light in his eyes, and for the first time in 40 agonizing days, a sliver of impossible hope penetrated the oppressive gloom of his fear. "Go," the king said, his voice barely a whisper, "and the Lord be with you." In a gesture of royal favor and perhaps a desperate attempt to impose some semblance of military legitimacy on this suicidal mission, Saul tried to clothe David in his own armor. He placed the heavy bronze helmet on his head and draped his own coat of mail over the boy's slender frame. But the armor was cumbersome, unfamiliar, a weight of human expectation that did not fit David's spirit. He was not a soldier. And this was not a battle to be fought in a soldier's conventional way. He took a few clumsy, clanking steps and then stopped. "I cannot go in these," he said respectfully to Saul, "because I am not used to them." So he took them off. He walked away from the king's tent, deliberately turning his back on the symbols of human strength and earthly power. He went to the brook that trickled through the valley, its cool water a welcome relief from the oppressive heat. He knelt, his eyes scanning the smooth, water-worn stones. He was not merely looking for a weapon. He was choosing his instruments of faith. He selected 5 smooth stones, each one a perfect weight, a perfect shape for his sling, and placed them carefully in the leather pouch of his shepherd's bag. Then, with his simple wooden staff in one hand and his sling in the other, he turned his face toward the giant and began to walk. Goliath saw him coming, a mere boy, a splash of ruddy health striding out to meet the embodiment of death. He looked at David, at his youthful face and shepherd's attire, and he was filled with a towering, explosive contempt. He felt profoundly insulted that the army of Israel would send such a child, a lamb, to fight him. "Am I a dog?" Goliath bellowed, his voice a mocking, incredulous roar that echoed across the valley. "That you come at me with sticks?" And the giant, in his hubris, cursed David by his panoply of gods, by the cold, lifeless idols of stone and wood that the Philistines worshipped. "Come here," he taunted, a cruel, predatory grin spreading across his face, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." The armies on both hills held a collective breath. The fate of 2 nations, the honor of 2 gods, seemed to rest on this bizarre, grotesquely unequal contest. But David did not flinch. He did not tremble. He lifted his voice, and it rang out across the valley, not with the booming resonance of a giant, but with a clarity and strength that came from a deeper source. It was not the arrogance of a warrior, but the unshakable, triumphant certainty of a true believer. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin," David cried, his voice a song of pure faith. "But I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As Goliath, enraged by the boy's defiance, lumbered closer to attack him, David broke into a run, closing the distance, running quickly toward the battle line to meet his foe. Reaching into his bag as he ran, he took out one of the smooth stones. He placed it in the leather pouch of his sling, and with a practiced, fluid motion that was as second nature to him as breathing, he began to whirl it above his head, faster and faster, a blur of leather and latent power. The sling sang in the dry, tense air, a shepherd's humble song of defiance against a king's roar of pride. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he let it fly. The stone shot from the sling with an almost invisible speed, a tiny projectile of faith launched against a mountain of flesh. It flew straight and true, guided not by David's aim alone, but by the unseen hand of the God whose honor he was defending. It struck the giant squarely on his broad forehead, the only patch of vulnerable skin in his otherwise impenetrable armor of bronze and pride. The stone sank deep into his skull. For a single, surreal moment, the giant stood there, a look of stunned, almost comical surprise on his face. The mocking sneer was gone, replaced by a vacant, uncomprehending stare. He swayed, a great dark tree severed at its roots. Then, with a ground-shaking thud, that seemed to make the very valley floor tremble. Goliath of Gath, the champion of the Philistines, the 40-day terror of Israel, fell face down on the earth. A collective gasp, a sound of utter disbelief, went up from both armies. Silence. Then David, without a moment's hesitation, ran and stood over the fallen giant. The boy had no sword, but he did not need one. He reached down and drew the giant's own massive, fearsome sword from its sheath. The same blade that had been a symbol of terror was now to be the instrument of ultimate victory. With all his might, David brought the heavy blade down and severed the giant's head from his body. When the Philistines saw that their hero, their seemingly invincible champion, was dead, their arrogance shattered into a million pieces of raw panic. They turned and ran, and then, from the Israelite ranks, a sound erupted that had not been heard in over a month. It was a great unified shout of victory, a roar of fear transformed into triumphant, ecstatic faith. They surged down the hill, a tidal wave of renewed courage, chasing their terrified enemies. The battle won, not by the strength of their army or the wisdom of their king, but by the simple, profound faith of a single shepherd boy. David's victory was more than the felling of a physical giant. It was a timeless, spiritual lesson etched into the heart of a nation and preserved for all time. It was a thunderous declaration that the great battles of life are not always won by the strong, the experienced, or the well-equipped. They are won by those who, in the face of impossible, soul-crushing odds, dare to place their trust in a power far greater than their own. It was a living testament that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the presence of a faith that is greater than the fear. And in the quiet, dusty valley of Elah, under the silent, watchful gaze of heaven, a shepherd boy from Bethlehem taught a king, an army, and a world that the size of the giant you face is never as important as the size of the God you serve.